Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more of the Great War, week 172. The Russian October Revolution of 1917. We finally made it. Before we dive in, though, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. Okay. Now, I have a feeling because of the content of this episode may actually get more views than the average Great War video, or, well, I'm hoping. um, I said this a couple weeks ago, a few weeks ago by now, but yeah, I can't even remember when I said it. But if y'all can get me to 30,000 subscribers before the end of this series, I will immediately, like, once this series is over, maybe like with a week or two break in between, I will immediately jump into Indy's coverage of World War II week by week. So yeah, I need a little incentive to commit to something that is going to be even longer than this series, you know? I mean, there's still a chance I do it anyway, just because it's nice to have, like, knowing, like, every weekend what exactly I'm going to be reacting to. Because I record my videos on the weekends, I record a bunch, and then blah, blah, blah. I've explained this before, I don't really need to explain it at all, but record on weekends, it's nice to know, like, a little bit, it's a little comforting, you know? To know, like, I already know what I'm gonna watch this weekend. So, yeah, there's a chance, but also, like, it's a long ass series. I need some incentive. But yeah, I have a feeling this episode is probably going to be entirely devoted to the October Revolution. So, let's dive in.
Each episode of this show begins with a hook, something that hasn't happened so far in the war, but not today. This week's episode begins with a hook that has happened before. In fact, it happened only 8 months ago. Revolution in Russia.
Woo! Russian Revolution! Electric boogaloo! Let's go!
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Last week, the Central Powers' breakthrough on the Italian front, the Battle of Caporetto, continued, with the Italians retreating all week and the Germans and Austrians taking prisoners in the hundreds of thousands. Anzac mounted infantry performed brilliantly as the Ottomans were defeated at Beersheba. The Canadians advanced slightly at Passchendaele, taking heavy casualties. The British government announced its support for a national home for Jews in Palestine, and there was ominous unrest in Petrograd. And as this week unfolded, that unrest grew and exploded. On the 3rd, German and Russian soldiers fraternized on the northern front. On the 5th, Prime Minister and Minister of War Alexander Kerensky ordered troops outside.
You know, did this man flee the country? Because how did he get to live to 1970 under... He was leader of pre-commie Russia, and he managed to live through Stalin's regime. How wasn't he murdered?
Inside the city that he believed were loyal to him to enter the city to quell revolutionary activity. But on the 6th, they declined to do so. That evening, the Bolsheviks occupied the railway stations, the bridges over the Neva River, the state bank, and the telephone exchange. On the 7th, more than 18,000 Bolsheviks surrounded the provisional government ministers who had holed up in the Winter Palace and who were defended by fewer than 1,000 people. More than 13,000 sailors from Kronstadt had arrived in the city, dedicated to revolution. That evening, the cruiser Aurora, anchored in the Neva, announced that it would fire on the Winter Palace and fired blank charges to show it was serious. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the Bolsheviks had overrun the palace and scattered the defenders. On the 8th, Lenin proclaimed a new government, the Council of People's Commissars. Lenin was elected chairman of the council and was now...
That's Stalin and that's Trotsky. I don't know the other faces, though. That face looks familiar, as though I've seen it before, but I do not know the name.
nominally ruler of the capital city. Leon Trotsky became Commissar for Foreign Affairs. This was the October Revolution. We're still in October by the Russian calendar then in use. The first government decree that day was the Decree of Peace, which Lenin read out in the evening to an ecstatic crowd. On the 9th, Trotsky asked his ministry to translate it into foreign languages for immediate distribution abroad. But 100 officials loyal to either the Tsar or the provisional government walked out. On the 10th, 4 million copies will be sent to the front, calling for an end to the fighting.
Damn.
One thing here, this new government did not have the support of the moderate socialist revolutionaries, nor the Mensheviks in the Petrograd Soviet. And it had not been ratified by any constituent assembly. Until that could happen, it would be run by a series of ad hoc committees with no political legitimacy. As the week ended, it was still great turmoil in Petrograd and Moscow, since nobody had any idea how this was going to play out. There were a couple of things, though, that were playing out this week in Italy: Caporetto and Cadorna. Italian Army Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna had played very little part in the Battle of Caporetto. He hadn't actually thought there would even be a battle once the snow had arrived in the Julian Alps at the beginning of October. So he'd taken a 2-week-long vacation to Torino. Even when he returned, he still didn't listen to the rumors about an impending offensive, and that offensive had turned into a rout. And the fighting was still going on. On the 5th, the Germans crossed the Tagliamento, and the Italians were again on the retreat. On the 8th, the Germans were pushing the Italians towards the Piave River, and that day outflanked 17,000 Italians who surrendered. The same day, Austrian troops coming down from the Dolomites and Julian Alps occupied Vittorio Veneto, just 55 kilometers from Venice. In 10 days, the Italian retreat from Caporetto had been 100 kilometers, but at the end of the week, the Italians established themselves behind the Piave. King Vittorio Emanuele, who was technically in charge of the army, called a meeting of the leaders of the Western Allies for November 5th at Rapallo to try to deal with Italy's precarious situation.
Fire Cadorna, you dumbass. That's the solution. Get a competent fucking general. I got a little heated there, I'm sorry.
Cadorna didn't bother attending and sent General Carlo Porro instead. At the conference, Porro claimed the Germans had attacked with 35 divisions, not the 7 they had actually attacked with. The Italians asked French and British Prime Ministers Paul Painlevé and David Lloyd George for 15 British and French divisions to be sent at once. The British sent in 5 artillery and infantry divisions, and the French 6. The king was now furious with Cadorna.
Actually pretty generous.
And called for another meeting the 8th. In English, he told those assembled that the responsibility for the Caporetto disaster lay with the Italian generals, and he called for the resignation of Cadorna and Luigi Capello.
Finally! Jesus Christ.
Now Cadorna grew furious and blamed everyone but himself. He refused to resign. The king fired him.
Finally! He's gone. The suffering of this man's dumbassery can finally be ended. I don't have to hear his stupid name week by week.
The general consensus was that the Duke of Aosta, who was still undefeated, should replace Cadorna. But the king didn't want to appoint a cousin, so he appointed General Armando Diaz as his new chief of staff. Diaz was a lot different from...
You know, it does make sense, like, making the decision not to, you know, promote your cousin after firing this one dude, right? Like, that could be conceived as wrong, like, even though the Duke is probably the best option that the Italians have, I understand the king's decision here in the regards of, like, let's not promote my cousin.
From Cadorna. He was from the south, from Naples, and was of Spanish descent. He had originally been an artillery officer, though he'd spent the bulk of 2 decades in Rome as a staff officer. As a younger man, he had seen action in Libya where he'd been wounded and decorated, and in the World War, he'd risen quickly through the ranks, commanding infantry regiments on the Carso. He became a corps commander in April this year, and his corps was the only one to gain ground in the 10th and 11th battles of the Isonzo River.
Okay, you know what? He's a pretty good pick, too.
Unlike Cadorna,
Unlike Cadorna, he is smart. He has a brain. He has more than one brain cell.
Cared deeply for the welfare of his men and was concerned with keeping
Oh my God. He has empathy.
casualties as low as possible. His jobs now were to rebuild the Italian army and hold the Piave line. Also at that conference, the Allies decided on the creation of a Supreme Allied War
And imagine if Italy had fired Cadorna earlier on when he had clearly proven his stupidity. Imagine, like, how much better off they would be. Honestly, they probably could have broken Austro-Hungarian lines if they had gotten rid of Cadorna sooner.
Council for the Western Front. Now, this was to be a body charged with constantly surveying the field of operations as a whole, and from the information gathered, coordinating the plans of the different general staffs. There was a breakthrough on another front that also continued this week, the Palestine front. Following the capture of Beersheba, Gaza now fell after a massive bombardment from 10 British and French naval vessels off the coast. A German sub managed to sink 2 of them. A combined infantry and mounted assault then hit the city and in minutes overwhelmed the defenses that Kress von Kressenstein had spent the year building. This whole campaign featured more and more cavalry and mounted infantry charges, used for their shock value, then culminating in hand-to-hand combat. On the 8th, for example, the Warwickshire and Worcestershire yeomanry charged Turkish positions at Huj that were supported by machine guns and artillery. A whole heap of men and horses went down 20 or 30 yards from the muzzles of the guns. The squadron broke into a few scattered horsemen at the guns and then seemed to melt away completely. I had the impression I was the only man alive. I was amazed to discover we were the victors. Lieutenant Wilfred Mercer. They then turned the captured machine guns on the fleeing enemy. Any way you slice it, cavalry overrunning machine guns is a serious achievement. But cavalry's main advantage was that it could provoke total panic on breaking through. However, in spite of British General Edmund Allenby's success, the Ottomans repeatedly escaped encirclement and withdrew to fight again. And the Canadians were fighting again as well, on the Western Front at Passchendaele. The assault November 6 was in fact to be an all-Canadian one. In all other sectors, only artillery would engage. 2 Canadian divisions attacked at 6 a.m. General Arthur Currie was going for speed and surprise, and after just 2 minutes of shelling, the creeping barrage began. The infantry had already crawled into no man's land in the dark, and thus avoided the German artillery that now fell on their trenches. By 7:45, 2 battalions of the 1st Division were already 1 kilometer from their assault trenches. The 2nd Division had taken Passchendaele itself by 7:40. A pile of bricks with the ruin of a church, a mass of slaughtered masons.
Wow. So, like, this is the pre-war image, right? Yeah. You can't even really tell where, like, even the larger buildings once stood. Yeah, you can't, God damn, like, you can only tell that this is the same place because of the road design here. Wow.
Masonry and nothing else left on this shell-swept height. The men could see in the distance across the far end of the remains of the village a land of tall trees and green fields with undamaged houses and unmarked fields, an incredible contrast to the battlefield. Canadian troops drove the Germans off enough of Passchendaele Ridge for British Army Commander Sir Douglas Haig to claim victory. The price of this little victory was almost exactly what Currie had predicted a couple of weeks ago for it: 16,000 men.
Damn.
And the week ends with a new Italian commander trying to stem the tide. British success in Palestine, Canadian success at a heavy cost at Passchendaele, a Supreme War Council formed, and Austrian General Svetozar Boroyevich von Boyna is promoted to Field Marshal.
Okay.
And there was another revolution in Russia. But you know
another
what?
Saturday in Russia.
This Bolshevik coup, for that's what it is at the moment, was not the heroic rise of the workers you find in Russian histories. It was the exhausted capitulation of Kerensky's moribund and virtually defenseless government. Seriously, the under 1,000 defenders I mentioned that were guarding his government at the time at the Winter Palace, that was made up of teenage cadets a bicycle squad, 2 companies of Cossacks, and 135 women from a women's death battalion who expected to fight Germans at the front and had no desire to defend Kerensky's government. That was it, against tens of thousands of Bolshevik Red Guards and revolutionary sailors. At least, though, there was not a great deal of blood. For now.
For now. Dun, dun, dun.
If you want to learn more about Russia before...
And that was the Russian October Revolution of 1917. The Great War, week 172. I've got nothing to add here at the end. This was a good week. I liked the information being shared. I think he covered the start here. There probably wasn't much more depth he could really... I don't think there was much need for Indy to go into any greater depth in regards to the start here of the October Revolution. I think what he covered was honestly good for the length of these weekly videos, so I really have no complaints. I hope you guys enjoyed as well. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.